Freezing to death doesn't hurt nearly as much as a broken heart. Clara learned this at 10,000 feet, abandoned by the husband she trusted, blinded by a Rocky Mountain whiteout, and following a frantic dog into a hidden mountain crevice. What waited inside that darkness defied all logic. Divorce papers possess a strange, terrifying finality. Just 3 weeks prior, Clara Hughes sat across a polished mahogany table in downtown Denver and signed away the last 8 years of her life. Her now ex-husband, Greg Hastings, hadn't even looked her in the eye. He was too busy checking his phone, likely texting the 23-year-old paralegal he had quietly moved into their shared vacation home. Greg had taken the savings, the house in Boulder, and the mutual friends. All he left Clara with was a profound sense of worthlessness, and Barnaby, a 90-pound Alaskan Malamute and Golden Retriever mix who had always preferred Clara anyway. Desperate to escape the suffocating pity of her family and the hollow quiet of her new, cramped apartment, Clara rented a secluded A-frame cabin deep in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado. It was late November. The tourist season had died down, and the wilderness promised the kind of absolute isolation Clara felt she needed to scream, cry, and piece her shattered identity back together. On a Tuesday morning, the sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, a signature Colorado bluebird day. The local weather app predicted clear skies and a high of 40 degrees. It was the perfect day to hike the Devil's Whisper, a moderately challenging 4-mile loop that wrapped around a dense pine valley and offered sweeping views of the Continental Divide. Clara packed a thermos of black coffee, 2 protein bars, and thermal leggings. She thought she was prepared. She was only planning to be gone for 3 hours. For the first hour, the hike was therapeutic. The crisp air burned her lungs in a good way. Barnaby trotted happily ahead, his golden-furred tail waving like a flag, occasionally burying his snout in the dusting of snow that lingered from a previous storm. Clara's mind, however, kept drifting back to Greg. She remembered the gaslighting, the late nights he claimed to be at the office, the realization that she had given her entire youth to a man who discarded her the moment a shinier, younger option appeared. The emotional agony was so loud in her head that she didn't notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. It started with a sudden, eerie silence. The birds stopped calling. The wind, which had been a gentle rustle through the pine needles, died completely. Then the temperature plummeted. It didn't drop gradually. It felt as though someone had opened the door to a massive industrial freezer. Clara stopped, her breath pluming in thick white clouds before her. She looked up. The brilliant blue sky had been swallowed by a bruised, charcoal-gray underbelly of clouds rolling over the jagged mountain peaks with terrifying speed. "Barnaby, come here," Clara called out, a sudden knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "We need to head back." Before she could even turn around, the first flakes began to fall. They weren't gentle, drifting snowflakes. They were hard, icy pellets driven by a sudden, violent gust of wind that nearly knocked Clara off her feet. Within 10 minutes, the world vanished. The phenomenon is known as a whiteout, but reading about it and experiencing it are 2 entirely different beasts. Clara could not see the trees 10 feet away. She could not see the rocky drop-off to her left. She could barely see Barnaby, who had pressed himself against her leg, whining nervously. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She pulled her scarf up over her nose and squinted into the swirling vortex of white, trying to locate the blue blazes painted on the tree trunks that marked the trail. There was nothing, just an endless, dizzying canvas of blowing snow. She began to walk in what she prayed was the direction of the trailhead. Every step was a battle against the gale-force winds that shrieked through the canyon. The snow accumulated at an impossible rate, rising past her ankles, then halfway up her calves. Her heavy boots felt like lead weights. With the wind chill, the temperature had to be hovering well below 0. "Okay, Clara, keep moving." "Just keep moving," she muttered aloud, though the wind snatched the words from her mouth. An hour passed. Or maybe it was 3. Time lost all meaning in the blinding storm. Clara realized with a sickening lurch in her gut that she was not on the trail anymore. The terrain had grown aggressively steep and uneven. She was tripping over hidden roots and falling into snow-filled ravines. Her hands, despite her thick gloves, were growing numb. The tips of her fingers burned, then transitioned into a frightening, painless ache. The physical suffering began to eclipse her emotional trauma. Greg's betrayal, the empty apartment, the stolen savings, none of it mattered anymore. The universe had stripped away all her complex human problems and replaced them with a single primal imperative: survive. But the mountain was indifferent to her struggle. The cold was a living, breathing entity, slowly wrapping its icy fingers around her heart, squeezing the life out of her. By late afternoon, the light began to fail, turning the whiteout from blinding bright to a suffocating, murky gray. Clara was exhausted. Her body had been burning calories at an astronomical rate just to keep her core temperature up, and now the tank was empty. She fell to her knees in a snowdrift, her muscles screaming in protest. Just for a minute, she thought, her eyelids drooping heavily. I just need to rest my eyes for a single minute. Hypothermia is an insidious killer. It doesn't arrive with violence. It arrives with a warm, deceptive embrace. Clara stopped shivering. That was the first bad sign. A strange, euphoric lethargy washed over her. The snow beneath her suddenly didn't feel so cold. It felt soft, like a down comforter. Her mind painted an image of her childhood bedroom, the radiator hissing a lullaby. She curled into a ball, ready to surrender. It would be so easy just to let go. A sharp, painful tug on her sleeve jolted her awake. Barnaby was standing over her, his coat completely matted with ice and snow. His dark eyes were wide and frantic. He growled a deep, guttural sound she had never heard him make before and yanked on the heavy nylon of her parka. "Barnaby, stop," Clara mumbled, her lips stiff and clumsy. "I'm just tired, buddy." The dog refused to listen. He let go of her sleeve, grabbed the thick collar of her jacket in his jaws, and pulled with all his 90 pounds of muscle. Clara slid a few inches through the snow. When she didn't get up, Barnaby began to bark. It wasn't his usual playful yap. It was a booming, desperate alarm that pierced the howling wind. He nudged her face roughly with his wet, freezing nose, then bit her gloved hand, hard enough to cause a flare of pain. The pain sparked a tiny ember of adrenaline in Clara's sluggish brain. If she stayed here, Barnaby would stay with her, and he would die too. Greg had left her, but this dog had never left her side. She couldn't fail him. Groaning, Clara forced herself onto her hands and knees, then staggered upright. Her legs shook violently. Okay, I'm up." Barnaby didn't wait. He immediately turned and began plowing through the waist-deep snow, looking back every few seconds to ensure she was following. He wasn't heading back the way they came. He was leading her directly toward the towering, jagged wall of granite that flanked the canyon. "Barnaby, no, the trail isn't that way," Clara yelled, her voice hoarse. The dog ignored her, barking insistently and waiting for her to catch up before pushing forward again. Clara had no choice. She was too disoriented to navigate herself, and the dog seemed possessed by a singular, unyielding purpose. They reached the base of the massive rock face. The granite loomed overhead, disappearing into the swirling gray snow above. Barnaby began digging frantically at the base of a large snowdrift, banking against the stone. "What are you doing?" Clara cried, leaning against the rock to keep from collapsing. Within moments, Barnaby had cleared away a section of snow to reveal a narrow, jagged fissure in the granite. It was barely 2 feet wide, a dark slash in the gray rock that looked entirely uninviting. To Clara's horror, Barnaby squeezed his large frame into the crack and vanished into the darkness. "Barnaby!" Clara screamed, lunging forward. She couldn't lose him in there. She pressed her face to the opening. It was pitch black inside, but instantly she felt something incredible. A subtle, unmistakable draft of warm air. It smelled faintly of earth, dry minerals, and something slightly metallic, like sulfur. With her last ounce of strength, Clara turned sideways, held her breath, and forced her body into the narrow crevice. The rough granite tore at her parka. She shuffled sideways into the dark, claustrophobic tunnel, terrified she would get stuck. The passage was maybe 10 feet long, but every inch felt like miles. Suddenly, she stumbled forward, the rock walls falling away. She dropped to her knees on a hard, dry stone floor. It was completely dark, save for the faint gray light filtering through the crack she had just squeezed through. But the temperature change was staggering. It had to be at least 50 degrees inside this chamber. The biting, killing wind was completely silenced, replaced by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the clicking of Barnaby's nails on the stone. Clara fumbled in her jacket pocket with numb, uncoordinated fingers until she found her smartphone. No service, of course, but the battery was at 20%. She turned on the flashlight feature. The beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating her salvation. She was in a naturally formed cave, perhaps 20 feet across and 10 feet high. The warmth was emanating from a small bubbling fissure in the floor at the far end of the cave, a tiny geothermal vent hidden deep within the mountain's crust. Barnaby was already lying near the vent, panting happily, the ice melting rapidly from his fur. Clara sagged against the cave wall, tears of sheer relief streaming down her freezing cheeks. They were out of the wind. They had warmth. They were going to survive the night. But as she swept the flashlight beam around the perimeter of the cave, her breath caught in her throat. Her relief instantly transformed into a chilling shock. They were not the first ones to find this hidden sanctuary. Tucked into a dry alcove against the eastern wall was a small, meticulously organized camp. There was a faded, vintage canvas sleeping bag laid out neatly on top of a foam pad. Next to it sat a rusted Coleman camp stove, a stack of unopened, dusty tins of baked beans, and a heavy-duty flashlight. Clara crawled closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. The items looked incredibly old, untouched for decades. A thick layer of dust coated everything. Lying on top of the sleeping bag was a weather-beaten leather journal. With trembling hands, Clara reached out and opened the cover. The pages were yellowed and stiff, but the ink was still legible. Property of Silas Vance. The first page read, written in neat, cursive handwriting, the 14th of August, 1978. If you are reading this, do not trust the voices in the valley. They sound like rescue, but they are not. Clara dropped the journal as if it had burned her. She looked wildly around the cave, the shadows cast by her phone's flashlight suddenly looking sinister and alive. The warmth of the cave no longer felt like a blessing. It felt like a trap. She had escaped the frozen grave of the blizzard, only to stumble into a 30-year-old mystery locked in a stone tomb with the ghost of a man who had clearly lost his mind. And outside, the storm continued to rage, sealing them inside. Clara dropped the weathered journal as if the leather binding had suddenly caught fire. The heavy thud of the book hitting the stone floor echoed against the cavern walls, a sound that seemed much too loud in the confined space. She scrambled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps until her spine pressed hard against the freezing, unforgiving granite. The name on the inside cover was Silas Miller. He hadn't been a lost hiker. According to the jagged, frantic script on the subsequent pages, he was an independent, geological assayer who had come to the San Juan Mountains in the late autumn of 1978. He, too, had been caught in a freak early-season whiteout. He, too, had found the geothermal vent. But Silas had never left. Clara's smartphone battery ticked down to 15%. The harsh LED light cast long, skeletal shadows across Silas's rusted camp stove and the forgotten tins of food. She forced herself to crawl forward, her hands trembling violently, and picked the journal back up. She needed to know what had happened to him. She needed to know if there was a way out. The first few entries were pragmatic. Silas documented the dimensions of the cave, the temperature of the vent, and his rationing of supplies. But as the pages turned, the handwriting degraded. The neat cursive dissolved into harsh, erratic scratches that tore through the yellowed paper. Day 4. Read an entry near the middle of the book. The storm stopped yesterday, but the snowdrift blocking the fissure is frozen solid. I cannot dig through. But that isn't the worst part. The valley is speaking again. It uses my mother's voice now. It begs me to come outside and warm her up. It tells me the snow is a blanket. Day 6. They are angry today. They scream through the rock. The devil's whisper isn't just a name. It's a throat. It breathes. Clara swallowed hard, her mouth tasting of copper and fear. She looked over at Barnaby. The large Malamute mix was curled into a tight ball near the bubbling geothermal vent, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and rhythmic. The dog's calm demeanor was the only tether holding Clara to reality. It was just cabin fever, Clara whispered aloud, trying to convince herself. Hypoxia, isolation madness. He was down here too long. Then, the battery icon on her phone flashed red, and the screen went black. Total, suffocating darkness collapsed upon the cave. It wasn't the darkness of a bedroom at night. It was an absolute, blinding absence of light that felt physically heavy. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, but it made no difference. Panic, primal and suffocating, clawed up her throat. And then, she heard it. It started as a low, mournful vibration that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the stone itself. As the gale force winds outside battered the jagged peaks of the canyon, the unique geological formations of the valley funneled the air into the narrow fissures. It was an acoustic anomaly, a massive natural woodwind instrument played by a hurricane. But in the pitch black of the cave, it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like a choir of whispering voices. The frequency shifted, rising in pitch until it mimicked the cadence of human speech. Clara pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face, but the sound vibrated through her jaw and into her skull. "You're pathetic, Clara," she gasped, her eyes flying open into the void. The wind had sounded exactly like Greg. The auditory illusion was flawless, born from the acoustics of the canyon and weaponized by her own traumatized subconscious. "Did you really think I loved you?" The wind seemed to sigh, scraping against the granite overhead. "You're nothing. You're empty. You deserve to freeze." "Stop it!" Clara screamed into the dark. "You're not real. It's just the wind." The psychological torture of the divorce, which she had tried so desperately to outrun, had caught up to her in the most terrifying way imaginable. The cave was acting as an echo chamber for her deepest insecurities. The dark played tricks on her mind, conjuring phantom movements in the corners of her eyes. She felt an overwhelming, hypnotic urge to crawl back through the narrow crack, to walk out into the blizzard and let the cold numb the agonizing voices in her head. Silas had warned against it, but the urge to surrender was a physical ache. She pushed herself up on her hands and knees, orienting herself toward the faint, almost imperceptible draft of freezing air that marked the exit. She was going to leave. She was going to let the mountain claim her. Before she could move a foot, a massive, warm weight slammed into her chest, knocking her onto her back. Barnaby. The dog stood over her, his thick fur brushing against her face. In the darkness, he began to lick the freezing tears from her cheeks. He didn't whine, and he didn't bark. He just lay down heavily across her chest, pinning her to the stone floor. His heart was beating against her sternum, a steady, powerful, thumping rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. It was the rhythm of life. It was a tangible, undeniable proof of love that demanded nothing in return. Barnaby couldn't understand the whispers of the canyon, and he didn't care about Greg or the divorce papers. He only cared about Clara. Clara wrapped her arms around the dog's thick neck, burying her face in his fur. She matched her breathing to his. She focused solely on the smell of his wet coat, the heat radiating from his body, and the solid, heavy reality of his presence. "I've got you," she sobbed into his fur. "I'm staying. I'm right here." The wind continued to howl, and the canyon continued to whisper its cruel, mimicking taunts, but Clara stopped listening. Anchored by the unconditional love of a rescue dog, she closed her eyes and let the warmth of the geothermal vent slowly pull her into a fitful, exhausted sleep. When Clara finally opened her eyes, the oppressive, suffocating blackness had lifted. A faint, pearlescent gray light was filtering into the cave. She sat up, her body screaming in agony. Every muscle was incredibly stiff, and a dull, throbbing headache pulsed behind her eyes, a symptom of dehydration and the mild sulfur fumes from the vent. Barnaby was already awake, pacing anxiously near the narrow exit fissure, occasionally pausing to scratch at the stone. The wind had stopped. The silence in the cave was so profound it made her ears ring. Clara crawled toward the exit and peered through the crack. Her heart plummeted into her stomach. The blizzard had passed, but the aftermath was catastrophic. The howling winds had driven an immense avalanche of drift snow directly against the rock face. The narrow crevice that had been their salvation was now entombed behind a solid wall of packed, icy snow. The gray light was merely filtering through several feet of the frozen barrier. They were buried alive. Panic threatened to rise again, but Clara clamped down on it with a newfound ferocity. She had survived Greg's betrayal. She had survived the whiteout. She had survived the psychological horrors of the canyon's whispers. She refused to die digging her own grave. She scrambled back to Silas Miller's decaying campsite. The old tins in the sleeping bag were useless, but her eyes locked onto a rusted metal object half buried under a layer of dust near the back of the alcove. It was a vintage military-style entrenching tool, a small, folding steel shovel. Clara grabbed it. The wooden handle was brittle, and the hinge was fused with rust, locking the spade at a harsh 90-degree angle. But the metal blade was still intact. She returned to the fissure, wedged herself into the tight space, and began to hack at the snow wall. It was grueling, agonizing work. The snow had been packed so tightly by the wind that it possessed the density of concrete. The awkward angle of the rusted shovel made every strike a jarring shock to her shoulders and wrists. After 20 minutes, her hands were blistered and bleeding inside her gloves. After an hour, she was gasping for air, her vision swimming with dark spots. "Come on," she grunted, swinging the shovel again and again. "Break. Just break." Barnaby wedged himself into the crack beside her, using his massive paws to furiously dig and clear the chunks of ice Clara managed to chip away. They worked in tandem, woman and dog, driven by the pure, desperate instinct to see the sky again. 2 hours passed. Clara's arms felt like lead. She was running on adrenaline and the last dregs of her body's energy reserves. She reared back for another strike, her vision blurring. Crack. The steel blade bit into the snow, and suddenly a blinding, razor-thin beam of pure golden sunlight pierced the gloom, striking Clara directly in the eye. She dropped the shovel and tore at the remaining snow with her bare, bleeding hands. Barnaby lunged forward, shoving his head through the small opening and widening it with his shoulders. Together, they burst through the snowdrift and tumbled out onto the mountainside. Clara lay on her back in the snow, panting violently, shielding her eyes against the agonizingly bright light. The world had been transformed. The sky was a vibrant, immaculate blue, completely devoid of clouds. The jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains glittered like diamonds under a thick, pristine blanket of untouched snow. It was violently beautiful. She pulled herself to her feet, her legs trembling. She didn't know which way the trailhead was. The landscape was unrecognizable under the heavy snowfall. But as she looked up, she recognized the jagged, twin-peaked rock formation looming directly to the east. She remembered the last legible page of Silas's journal, which had featured a crude sketch of those exact peaks. He had written that the morning sun rising between the devil's horns pointed directly toward the old logging road that led to the valley floor. "This way, Barnaby," Clara croaked, her throat parched. "We follow the sun." The trek down the mountain was a brutal test of endurance. Without snowshoes, every step meant plunging waist-deep into the powder. Clara had to literally drag herself forward, using tree branches to pull her exhausted body through the drifts. Barnaby broke the trail ahead of her, his wide paws acting as natural snowshoes, looking back constantly to make sure she was still moving. By noon, Clara was hallucinating from sheer exhaustion. The tree line was a blur of green and white. She was on the verge of collapsing for the final time when a sound cut through the crisp mountain air. Thwip, 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 thwip. It wasn't the wind. It was mechanical, rhythmic. Clara scrambled to the top of a small ridge and looked down. Hovering a half-mile away over the valley floor was a bright orange helicopter bearing the insignia of Flight for Life, Colorado. She tore off her red parka, the freezing air biting instantly at her sweat-soaked thermals, and began to wave the jacket frantically above her head. Barnaby let out a booming, echoing bark that rolled down the mountainside. The helicopter banked sharply. They had been spotted. Within 30 minutes, the downdraft of the chopper was whipping snow into Clara's face as a rescue team descended. A man in a high-visibility jacket, later introduced as Captain Thomas Redfield of the Colorado Search and Rescue Board, ran toward her, his face a mask of professional urgency. "Ma'am, are you injured?" he shouted over the roar of the rotors, wrapping a thick foil thermal blanket around her shivering shoulders. Clara looked at the rescuer, then down at Barnaby, who was happily accepting a pat on the head from a paramedic. She looked back up at the towering, silent peaks of the Devil's Whisper. She thought of Greg, the divorce, and the shattered woman who had walked into these woods yesterday. That woman had died in the cave. The woman standing here, wrapped in foil and bruised to the bone, was someone entirely different. "No," Clara said, her voice raspy but steady. "I'm exactly where I need to be." 2 days later, Clara lay in a specialized recovery bed under the care of Dr. Peter Hackett at the Institute for Altitude Medicine in Telluride. She had lost feeling in 2 of her toes, and her body was bruised and battered, but she was alive. As the nurses wheeled Barnaby into the room, a blatant violation of hospital policy that the staff happily ignored, Clara smiled. She hadn't just survived the mountain, she had survived herself. The blizzard had stripped away everything she thought she needed, leaving only the bedrock of her own resilience and the unwavering devotion of the dog who had refused to let her go. If Clara and Barnaby's incredible journey of survival, resilience, and unbreakable loyalty inspired you today, don't keep this story to yourself. Hit that like button to honor Barnaby's heroism. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength. And subscribe to our channel for more gripping, real-life stories of human endurance. What would you do in Clara's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.